Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to another episode of Chasing Legends. Thanks for joining us here on Chasing Legends of the Superstition Mountains. This week I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. We're going to go back in a time machine to about 1978, 79. And during this trip, we went out and we'd set up camp, and we're going to spend a few days in Pinyon Camp. It's down at the base, kind of a southwest area of Weaver's Needle. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it. And we had kind of packed in, kind of dropped everything, and there's a nice area, there's a nice little grove of trees. You get some shade during the day, and it's January, February, I would say probably a 78. And we're sitting back, and we set up camp, and it was kind of a strange thing because nobody was around. Usually it's pretty busy during that time of year, and there really wasn't anyone around. So we kind of set camp. We didn't have any tents. The weather looked clear. We were hoping for it. So we were just sleeping out on the ground. We had some ground tarps, and we just kind of set those out. We set up, and I remember the first night we had stew. Now there was a guy, and I think his name was Eddie, and he had brought that Barney Bernard book that Hyam had written, and Barnard got the rights to. And he brought that, and he was reading out of it, and that's kind of that first night what we were getting ready to we were going to hear him tell stories. He was kind of possessive of it, wouldn't let anybody else touch it. But we were all listening to it. I was really interested because I hadn't heard those stories. I'd heard some of the stories I heard, but and that one kind of was a different take on things, but I'd never seen it before, so it was very cool. We're sitting back, and if you're in the canyons there and you're very familiar with it because of the main mountain, Superstition Mountains, on your west side, it literally, once the sun comes behind those mountains, it just becomes dusk. And it's like that for quite a while, but it gets very dark early. So we're sitting there, things are coming down, we got the campfire going, and we hear boom. And everybody looks around, and you just hear this echoing boom everywhere. And we figure someone had set off some dynamite somewhere back in the canyons. Couldn't tell. It was loud. And probably 15 seconds later, there's another boom. And we just kind of, again, look around, kind of check things out. Shortly after that, a minute or so later, there's a couple shots like a rifle. And then again, it's quiet. And we couldn't figure out the distance because down there, the sound, the way it'll travel is you just can't put any direction. We figured it had to come somewhere north or east of us. So we're sitting back and we're listening, and it's very quiet. Like I said, there was no one else around. We were the only people camped there. And I remember 5, 6, 7 minutes goes by, and boom again. And we all look at each other like, what's going on? And it's starting to get dark now. So we kept the fire going, kind of read from the Barney Barnard thing. You kind of chalk it into, and remember, this is 78, 79. They didn't close down kind of start pushing the prospectors out till 81. So we're kind of all just sitting there, a little uneasy, but it didn't seem that close, did it? We read, settle down, get to sleep. Next day we get up, and we started to do things, and a couple guys took off, heading towards on the south side of the Needle, going east. And we're heading over to kind of look out that way to see if they could see anything or see what might have been going on. We didn't know of anybody working there. Celeste Jones, Ed Piper, that was all the late 50s, early 60s. None of those guys were there at the time. Al Morrow and his work, that was 1970. Al passed away. So we weren't as familiar with everybody back in there, but we were trying to judge about where maybe things come from. So these two guys take off. They're gone maybe an hour, and we hear rifle shots, 3 or 4. And of course, everybody's looking at everybody. Everybody's thinking, man, what happened? And you got to remember, I'm just a kid. I was 14 or 15 at the time. So I'm just sitting there thinking, man, what can be going on back out there? So, and I think the only thing I carried when I came back in the mountains at that time, the rifle I had would have been a .223. So you're kind of sitting there and you're not prepared for this. And I'd heard this sort of thing before, but never been sitting here. Still, there's no one coming through. We hadn't seen anyone, heard anybody else outside of all this stuff. So we're sitting down and we're wondering where those guys are. And I think we had just come to the point that, hey, maybe couple guys need to go out and look and see where these guys went. And they came kind of back around the backside of us, so they must have kind of skirted everything, and they came in, and they'd been sneaking around, and they said they'd heard some guys talking and yelling and then the rifle shots, but they couldn't tell if it was directed at them or what was going on. So they came back into camp. We were all kind of, again, kind of concerned, thinking maybe we'll just wrap up after tomorrow morning, because it was late in the afternoon at that point. Maybe we'll just eat tomorrow morning, get up, wrap everything up. We're not going to spend a third night down here. Don't know what the activity is and what's going on exactly. So let's get everything wrapped up and all. So we did the same routine. I think that night would have been chili, because it's usually stew and chili and stuff like that, something easy. And we did all that, and the same thing. It's probably 4:30, 5 o'clock, and it's getting dusk and dark down in there, and you hear the booms, 2 of them, boom. And then probably 30 seconds later, another boom. And of course, again, we're all sitting there, we're waiting for the rifle shots, and now we're anticipating everything we'd heard the night before. And nothing else happened, but it was kind of uneasy. Everybody's kind of like sleeping there, waiting for something, listening for something. But we finally go to sleep. We get up the next morning and cooking breakfast, and I can't tell you what we had in breakfast. Usually it was nothing fancy. It was something quick, and it was usually kind of oatmeal or something like that, just to stick to you and get done. Occasionally eggs. And you got to remember, back in these days, all the gear was heavy, so you tried to pack as light as you could on anything you could possibly, because the sleeping bags, the bed rolls, tents, tarps, everything was canvas, everything was heavy back in that days. They were just starting to come out with the nylon stuff. So we're all kind of scattered about, decided to pick everything up, and these 2 guys come walking into camp. And they look pretty rough, worse for wear. They're dirty. Didn't see any firearms on them at all. They came in, looked like they had 2-3 weeks worth of beard, dark haired, just looked like they'd been out there for a while. They were pretty filthy. And they come just wandering in and saw we had a pot of coffee on there on the fire. So they came in and, mind if we grab a cup? And back in the mountains those days, you would kind of socialize. Someone would come into camp. There didn't seem to be a problem. So they kind of sat back. What you guys doing? Yeah, what do you got? We were just not really doing much of anything. We were just kind of camping out, looking through the area, and we didn't give much, and they didn't say much. And they were there for about a half hour. And the whole time you just had that, what do these guys want? Where'd they come from? Because they didn't even have regular packs or anything like that. They had a couple of these they were the non-frame little haversacks, canvas haversacks. Couldn't have had much in them, so we figured they hadn't been, they were passing through or they were checking us out. So, and they didn't have much water. So I remember we kind of as soon as they split off, they kind of went off like they were heading for Fremont Saddle, leaving. And one of the guys said, well, I'm going to just kind of go back over here like I'm going to relieve myself, and I'm going to kind of see if I can follow where they go. See if I keep an eye on them, what they're doing, make sure they're leaving the area. And we started packing everything up because we figured we're done, we're going to leave. And he comes back half hour later and said they actually started working that way and then cut off and then worked up into the main mountain, kind of looking like for some high ground or climbing up in that way, kind of doubling back a little. Which made everybody nervous again, because what's their intention? What are they doing? So we packed everything up, kind of hit the trail. The idea was, everybody was told, don't be looking for them, trying to make eye contact like we know they're there. We don't know what they're up to. We didn't see any rifles, so maybe they're just keeping an eye on us. And we started working our way back up the trail. I remember we were coming out, and you could see they were up in the rocks just beyond us, and we kind of noticed the movement once or twice as we kind of worked our way up and kind of worked out of there. And this is a good lesson in what the mountains were like back in the 70s, because in the 70s there was a lot of that went on. You would cross people, a lot of people wouldn't speak to you, they'd just pass you. You'd see some guy look like he had the world, everything he owned in the world on his back. And he would just be kind of like, and he'd keep, as soon as he'd see people, they rarely ever moved off the path, or if they could disappear, they would disappear before you got to him. You might see a guy a quarter mile down the trail and then never run into him because he jumped off. But a lot of times they'd come by, put their head down, and then they just go by, and if you said good morning or how's it going, all you would get is probably, you know, and they always kind of just went on by, and we just kept moving. And wish back then I would have had a camera taking pictures, because it would have been interesting to know who a lot of these people were. But that day, that whole time, man, that was back at the end of that era of where guys were back in there and never knew who they were, never recognized those guys. All the pictures, everything I've went through with the Historical Society, I've always wondered who those two guys were and where they were working and why they came back into our camp and why they kind of came down and just were checking on us, what we were doing and stuff. And there was a lot of paranoia, but it's a good story back in the day. We all made it out and everything, you know, but things weren't the same. Within a couple years, they were pushing everyone out. And the last claims went in that they would never let anybody work again. So it was kind of the end of an era. And I didn't know it at the time, but it was interesting. It was kind of the end of that era where you still had the guys back in there prospecting, dynamiting, and working back in the mountains. And who knows who could be. It could have been far as Peters Mesa, could have been as close as Needle Canyon. It was just hard to say. But thanks for joining us. Nice little story back in the day of me back in my much thinner and younger days. And join us again next Monday on Chasing Legends of the Superstition Mountains.